In the England of those years, a person was known before ever they were seen, and they were known by wax. A letter came up the drive to a great house, and the man who took it did not read the name first. He read the small, hard coin of colored wax at the fold, and the shape pressed into it, the tower, or the hound, or the little crowned bird that told him in one glance whose hand had written and how quickly the master must be fetched. Every house of any account had its device, its beast, or star, or crossed keys, pressed down by a ring or a small brass press kept in a locked drawer, and the mark was older, commonly, than the walls it sealed, a thing handed down from the buried to the breathing. A seal was a second face. It went ahead of you into rooms you would never enter, and it spoke for you there. And so the loneliest soul in all that bright and ordered country was not the beggar at the crossroads, who was at least plainly what he seemed. It was the one who owned no seal that could be shown, whose true mark, pressed into honest wax before honest eyes, would open a grave. Such a person, though almost no one in the county would have believed it of her, was the Duchess of Wentmere. She had been 3 years a duchess, and in 3 years the county had not settled on one firm opinion of her, which was the greatest achievement of her life, and one she could confess to no one. She was neither handsome nor plain enough to be remembered for it, neither witty in company nor foolish enough to be laughed at after. At dinner, she said the small, correct nothing a hostess must, and passed out of her guests' memory before their carriages reached the gate. This was no accident of nature. It was a labor kept up daily for 3 years, and for harder years before them, the work of a woman who had learned as a child that to be noticed is the beginning of being destroyed, and had made of her own quietness a small gray country she could live in unfound. The county forgave her the dullness, more or less, because it was still busy failing to forgive the Duke. It had never forgiven him the marriage. Dukes of Wentmere married earls' daughters, or great fortunes, or at the least a face worth crossing a room for. This one had gone away one gray autumn and come home married to a companion, a paid nobody who read novels aloud to some old woman in a watering town, a girl with no family anyone could name, no fortune, and no beauty to excuse the want of both. He gave no reason. That was the part the county could not get past. He gave none then and none in the 3 years since. Asked, he rested his flat gray eyes on the asker until the asker found something else to say. The Duke of Wentmere did not explain himself. It was the first thing anyone told you of him, and the last. And between the two there was little else, for he was a man who did in the world and did not account to it. They lived in a courtesy so complete that at a distance it might have passed for tenderness, and was not. Each evening she sat with him, an hour in the library, while the day's letters were made ready. And it was she who dressed them, folding the stiff paper, dropping the wax, pressing down the Wentmere heron that was his device, and, by marriage, the only device the world allowed her. She had grown fond of the heron in a way she would have been ashamed to say. It stood in cold water and waited and missed nothing, and she felt a cousinship with it that had nothing to do with her husband. When she was afraid, and she was afraid far oftener than anyone guessed, she had a habit so small that in 3 years no servant had marked it. She pressed the pad of her thumb hard into the center of her palm, and there, against her own skin where no eye could follow, she drew the shape of a thing she had not spoken of to any living person since she was a child of 9. It steadied her. It was the nearest thing to prayer left to her. It was on an evening at the raw end of winter, the wax warm and the heron waiting under her hand, that a letter came up the drive beneath a seal she did not dress and had never been allowed to touch. The porter came in fast, the way men do when the mark tells them to hurry. The wax was the deep, clean red kept for one house only in the kingdom, and the device stamped in it was the crown. The Duke broke it, read it once, unhurried, giving nothing away. Then he did a thing he had not done in the whole 3 years of their marriage. He laid the king's letter down, and he looked at his wife. He did not tell her that night what the letter said. He asked whether she was quite well, and she said she was, and he wished her good night. She climbed to her cold room, sat at the black glass, and knew, with the flat certainty of a woman who has waited years for a particular blow, that the thing she had buried so long had sent word ahead of itself, and was already on the road to Wentmere. Once, before she was the woman the county could not trouble to remember, she had owned a name that farmers touched their hats to. She had been born Aveline of Marbeck, and the Marbecks were old, past the reach of anyone's grandfather. Their lands lay along a green river in the west, and above the great door of their house, cut in stone and pressed into every letter that left it, was the Marbeck device, a hand holding a sprig of broom. Broom, because it grows on the poorest ground there is, her father said, and flowers anyway. And there was the whole family in one small picture. Her father had been the earl, and she had loved him the plain, enormous way a child loves before the world teaches measure. She remembered the night he took her small, cold hand and set her thumb to the face of the seal in the dark, and would not let them light a candle. Know it blind, he told her. Learn it with your skin. Wax they can melt and stone they can break, and a whole house they can pull down to the cellars. But the thing your own hand knows in the dark is yours, and no court in this kingdom can attaint the inside of a hand. She had been perhaps 8, and had thought it a game, and traced the little hand and its sprig against her own palm until she could do it with her eyes shut, and he called her the keeper of the seal. Within the year he was put to death, and the game was the only inheritance that came to her. The charge was treason, and its proof a letter said to be in the earl's own hand, though the hand was a paid forger's, and his enemies were content not to look too closely. One man of rank and patience had seen how a dead northern cause could be made to carry a living grudge, and he wanted the Green Valley, and got it. The house was attainted, which is a cold, tidy word for a burning. The name struck from the rolls, the lands and honors forfeit to the crown, and from the crown, with wonderful speed, into the very hand that had schemed for them. The earl was put to death, his people scattered like birds from a felled tree, and a child of 9 hurried through a scullery door in the dark and lifted onto a carrier's cart with another name sewn crooked into her hem, went down into the wide gray country of the forgotten, and did not come up out of it for 16 years. She learned that country well. To be known was to be found, and to be found was to be finished. And safety was a gray coat, a lowered eye, and a name so flat it slid off the memory like water off oiled cloth. She was a servant, then a sewer of seams, then companion to idle ladies who wanted their novels read and their small cruelties admired. And she was good at it, because she wanted nothing and showed nothing. That was the whole of her life, until the day the Duke of Wentmere walked into a subscription library in a watering town, a tall, grave man she had never seen, and looked at her one long moment, as though he read not her face, but something written a great way behind it. Within the month he had married her, and given her no reason. And she, who carried the deepest secret in the kingdom folded in her own hand, had never dared ask him for his. For terror, the asking would spring the lock on hers. She was still at the window when the gray light came, and with it, far down the pale drive, a carriage, and behind it a second, and on the door of the first, small and unmistakable even at that distance, the burning red and the crown of the king. The past had not sent a letter after all. It had come itself, and it was at the gate. The king's man was named Sir Nevin Halcott, and he was precisely the sort of person the crown will send when it wishes to learn a thing without appearing to have asked it. He was neither young nor old, neither warm nor plainly cold, dressed with a quietness that had cost a great deal of money, and he came into the great hall of Wentmere Court, smiling and looking about him with the frank pleasure of a man who values fine things and misses none of them. He begged the Duke's pardon for the descent upon him. It was, he said, the smallest matter in the world, a piece of dry business only, the sort of tidying a new reign always brings. The king's officers were going quietly through certain old forfeitures of the last age, confirming the crown's title here and there, closing the books upon estates long ago fallen in. A formality, purely. He named 2 or 3 great houses ruined in the last reign, in the easy way one names the weather, and among them, without the smallest change of voice, he named the valley and the house of Marbeck. The Duke of Wentmere said that he understood, and offered his guest wine, and told him nothing. They sat. Sir Nevin talked, pleasantly and at length, and watched while he talked, and the Duke answered in short, even words, and did not explain himself, which Sir Nevin, accustomed to gentlemen falling over their own tongues to account for themselves to the king's man, plainly found the most interesting thing in the room. He tried the Duke this way and that, as a man tries a locked door with several keys, and the door gave nothing, and the Duchess, because it is the invisible useful thing a quiet wife is for, sat a little apart and poured the tea, and wasn't looked at once by either man, which was the ordinary condition of her days, and had kept her alive through all of them. Then Sir Nevin set down his glass and said, but he had almost forgotten, and it was such a curiosity, the Duke being a man of taste. He drew from a flat leather wallet a small object, wrapped in soft cloth, and unwrapped it upon the table with the care of a jeweler, and turned it, so the light from the tall windows fell full upon its face. It was an old seal, a matrix of dark, tarnished silver set into a worn brass grip, the kind of press a great family keeps under lock and hands down the years like a name. Recovered, he said lightly, from the Marbeck lands, when the crown took them. A handsome old thing. He had thought the Duke might care to see the workmanship. Had his grace, he wondered, his eyes never once leaving the Duke's face, ever chanced to see its like before. The Duke looked at it a long moment and said, evenly, that he had not. And across the room, the Duchess of Wentmere, poring, saw the small silver face of the thing turn in the light, and saw the hand, and saw the sprig of broom, and the whole room went out from under her like a dropped floor. She did not cry out. 16 years had trained the cry out of her before it could ever reach her throat. But her hand upon the pot went still, entirely still, in the particular way that only a thing striving with all its strength not to move can be still, and the small, steady stream of tea stopped and did not begin again, and her thumb, all on its own, with no leave asked of her, crept to the center of her palm and pressed there, and began to draw against her own skin, in front of the king's man, the shape her father had set into her hand, in the dark, a lifetime ago, and told her no court could ever take away. It was the stillness that betrayed her, in a room where she had spent 3 years being nothing that any eye need trouble to watch. Sir Nevin Halcott felt the change in the air, the way a spider feels a far thread of its web tremble, and he turned his head, slowly, without hurry, and for the first time since he had entered that house, he looked, fully and with great attention, at the quiet and forgettable Duchess of Wentmere. And in the same instant, so did the Duke. She lifted her eyes and met her husband's across the width of the room, and for one bare, unarmored moment, the careful gray distance of 3 whole years simply was not there, and in his face, in the flat gray eyes that explained nothing to anyone living, she saw a thing she had never once seen there and had nowhere to put. She saw fear. Not fear for himself, fear for her. And she understood, with a lurch that took the ground from under her a second time, that a man is only afraid in that way for a person whose danger he already knows by heart, which meant that he knew, which meant that the reason he had never given her in 3 years of perfect courtesy had been standing silent in the room with them the whole of that time. For the length of 3 slow breaths, no one in that bright room moved, and Aveline understood that the whole of her life had just been decided by a thread of tea that stopped when it ought to have gone on pouring. It was the Duke who moved first. He did not so much as glance at her again. He reached out and turned the little silver seal on the table with one finger, unhurried, the way a man turns a thing that faintly bores him, and said that it was fine work, and he did not wonder the crown had kept it, and would Sir Nevin take a little more wine. And the moment, which had been on the very point of breaking like a wave, simply did not break. Sir Nevin's eyes went from the wife to the husband, and back, weighing and finding for the present nothing he could lay a hand to. He let the wine be poured. He also said, settling deeper into his chair, that he hoped he might trespass on Wentmere's hospitality some few days. The forfeiture papers were tedious things, and a house of this quality was not to be hurried through. The Duke said he was welcome as long as he cared to stay, in the voice of a man to whom it made no difference at all, and only Aveline, who had learned to read that voice as she read wax, heard beneath it that the hunter meant to sit in the covert until the bird broke from cover, and that her husband had, smiling, invited him to do it. She lay awake that night waiting for the thing her whole life had trained her to expect. She had been found, and when you are found, the people around you save themselves. She waited for the Duke to save himself, to send for her at first light and set her quietly aside, to some far house, a cottage, a packet boat, anywhere the danger she carried could not wash back over him. It was what a sensible man did. The summons never came. What came instead, at the gray hour, was a knock, and Mrs. Pinnock, the housekeeper, with a can of hot water and a fire already laid in the grate, and word that His Grace begged the Duchess not to trouble to come down while Sir Nevin was in the house, but to keep to the morning room and the library, where, Mrs. Pinnock added, repeating plainly what she had been told, and not troubling to understand it, she would come upon no one she did not choose to see. Aveline sat with that a long time. She had steeled herself for the door shut against her. What she had been handed instead was a wall, quietly built around her in the dark. It was in the morning room that she met the one soul in the household she had, in 3 years, contrived never quite to be alone with. Lady Grizzel was the Duke's great-aunt, near 80, small and dry and straight as a walking cane, with a tongue that had been feared across 3 reigns. She came in, took one look at Aveline's face, and began at once to talk, not because she had a thing to say, but because she had seen a frightened creature, and knew, as some very old people know, that a steady run of ordinary words is the kindest roof you can raise over someone who is shaking. She spoke of chimney sweeps and a wedding 40 years gone, and asked nothing, and let the words fall like a light, warm rain until the worst of the trembling had left the younger woman's hands. Only then did she fix upon Aveline 2 black eyes that had let very little escape them in 80 years. "You will not ask me anything," Lady Grizzel said, "and I shall not tell you much, for the whole of it is his to give, and he gives nothing, as you will long since have discovered. But I have watched that boy since he was in short coats, and I will say this once, and then we shall go back to chimney sweeps. Whatever you are, and whatever came into this house yesterday on the king's carriage, you are not to run from it. He has spent far longer readying himself for this day than you would credit. Do not undo the whole of his work by bolting like a hare on the first dark night. Now, do you take your tea with lemon or without?" And Aveline, who had walked into that room certain she was alone in all the world with a secret that could destroy her, sat holding a cooling cup and understood two things in one breath: that the old woman knew at least the shape of the thing, and that whatever her husband had been doing inside his silence through the 3 years of their marriage, it had not been nothing. It had been preparing for exactly this. He came to the library himself that evening, at the sealing hour, as though nothing in the wide world had changed, and that was how she knew that everything had. For 3 years they had sat together in that room, an hour at the close of the day, he with his letters, she folding and dropping the wax and pressing down the heron, and in all that time they had said to one another only the small, smooth nothings that oil a shared house. Tonight the letters lay unwritten on the table. He stood at the window with his back to her, a tall, dark shape against the last of the light, and for a long while neither of them reached for the wax at all. "You knew," she said at last. It was not a question. Her own voice startled her, for she had not meant to spend it. In the library at the watering town, the very first moment. "You did not marry a companion by chance. You knew whose daughter I was." He was quiet so long that she thought he meant to give her the same silence he gave the rest of the world. Then he said, without turning, "Yes." Only that. She waited for the remainder of it, the why and the how and the whole true shape of the thing, and it did not come, for he was a man who did not explain himself, and she saw, with something close to despair, that he would not break the habit even now, even here, even for this. But then he turned, and she saw it was not the shut silence of old, after all. It was a man standing at the very lip of speech and holding himself back from it by main strength, the way a man leans his weight on a door against a rising wind. "I cannot tell you all of it yet," he said. "Not because I do not trust you. Because if Halcott carries even one corner of it out of this house, it will be the end of you. And I have not spent 3 years keeping you from that fate, to lose you now to my own tongue. Ask me when he is gone. I will answer you then, and I will answer the whole of it." He stopped, and his voice, when it came again, had gone rough at the edge. "I have wanted to answer it for 3 years. It was more than he had said to her in the whole of their marriage, and every word of it was shelter. And still she waited, because her life had taught her past, all forgetting that shelter is the dearest thing there is, and the reckoning always comes. She waited for him to name what it would cost her, a true wife, perhaps, where there had only ever been a wife-in-law, her silence, her obedience, some price. She half wished he would name it, so that at least she might know the ground she stood upon. He named nothing. He crossed the room and took the cold stick of wax out of her hand, and did the thing she did each evening in his place, folded the paper and dropped the wax and pressed the heron down awkwardly, for it was not his practice, so that she need not hold her hand steady in front of him one moment more. Then he bade her good night and left her alone with the letters and the small, quiet wreck of everything she had thought she understood. She sat a long while with the seal in her hand. He had said, when he is gone, as though Sir Nevin Halcott were a passing weather that would blow itself out. But she had watched the king's man's face in the instant the tea stopped pouring, and she did not believe that man passed. She believed that man arrived and settled and dug. And she thought, turning the heron slowly in the candlelight, that she was not, after all, the only person beneath this roof who carried a secret that could open a grave, and that she did not yet know the half of what her husband had buried, nor what it would cost him when the king's patient hands began, as surely they would, to dig it up. The days that came after were the strangest of her life, and the whole of their strangeness lay in this, that nothing was asked of her. Sir Nevan Halcott stayed. He rode out daily to look upon the county with his pleasant, tireless eyes, and came back each dusk to sit at the Duke's table and speak of old forfeitures and fallen families, the easy way another man speaks of horses. And the Duke played the untroubled host, explained himself to no one, and gave the hunter nothing worth the carrying away. And Aveline kept inside the wall her husband had built about her, and waited for the toll to be asked, because it was the only thing she knew how to expect. A kindness of that size must surely carry a price to match it, and she braced for the naming of it, the way a body braces for a tooth to be drawn. The naming never came. He asked her for nothing at all. He guarded her, and told her almost nothing, and required of her less, and she found to her dismay that this was far harder to bear than any demand. A demand she could have met, or refused, or understood. This she could not get her hands around. It was like being kept warm by a fire that asked no wood. Let us pause here a moment before the next turn. If this story has taken hold of you, and you would rather not miss where it goes, follow the channel now, so the next part finds its way to you. Then come back, for the king's man is still in the house, and the digging is about to begin. And so, with no price to pay, and nothing to do inside her wall but watch, Aveline began, for the first time in 3 years, to truly watch her husband. She had married a locked door, and called it a marriage. Now, with her life balanced on knowing what manner of man stood between her and ruin, she began to look at him in earnest. And almost at once, she started to see things. The county, for all its long practice of talking of him, had never once suspected were there. The first thing she learned, once she began to watch him in earnest, was that the Duke of Wentmere did a great deal of good in the world, and took enormous pains that not one thread of it should ever be traced back to his hand. She learned it, as she learned everything in that house, by wax and by the corner of her eye. A wife who has folded a man's letters for 3 years comes to know the shape of his week, whether she means to or not. And there were letters that went out beneath the heron to a lawyer in the county town, and money followed after them, and the money hid itself in the account book under headings so dull the eye slid straight off them. A charity, a subscription, a fund for some deserving cause that, when she went hunting for it, kept no office, and printed no list, and lived nowhere on the earth but in the ledger of Wentmere. So she followed the money quietly to see where in the living world it came to ground. It came first to a man at the west gate, a soldier home from the wars, with one leg gone below the knee and a face shut like a fist. She fell into talk with him on a raw morning, and he was gruff, and then, unexpectedly, he was not. He had been begging at a hiring fair 3 winters back, a finished man with nothing before him but the ditch, when a tall, quiet gentleman had halted in the mud and looked at him a long while and asked him one thing only, the name of the place he had been born. And when the soldier gave the name, the gentleman had gone still as a held breath, and then had brought him to Wentmere and set him at the west gate with a wage and a roof, and in 3 years had never once spoken of it again, nor suffered himself to be thanked. The place the soldier had been born was Marbeck. It came next to a schoolroom in the village, a warm, bright room where a sharp, kind woman taught the poor children their letters. The room, she said, was kept by a fund for the schooling of the deserving young. Aveline sat there a morning, and asked the children their names, and knew before the woman answered where the answer lay. For the children were the children of the scattered Marbeck people, the grooms and dairymaids and undercooks flung to the winds 16 years before, without a character among them. Some patient hand had been gathering their children ever since, one at a time, and teaching them their letters, so that the ruin of the parents should not go down whole and unbroken into the sons. There was more of it besides, she came to see. Once she had the trick of looking. A dead tenant's daughter dowered and quietly married off to a decent man. A crippled thatcher pensioned through a lawyer so that the charity should seem to fall from the sky and not from a person. Everywhere the same care, and everywhere the same hidden hand. And it came, last and heaviest, to an almshouse 2 valleys off, where an old blind man sat by a clean fire in a warm room and was kept there entire, the matron said, by a private gentleman, who came now and then and sat with him and did not speak. Aveline gave no name. She sat with the blind man an hour while he turned his sightless face to the warmth, and he told her that he had been steward of a great house long ago, before his eyes and his luck failed together, and that a young lord had found him rotting in a poorhouse a dozen years since, and lifted him out of it and asked him for one thing only, which was to tell, and tell over again, every entry in a certain year of a certain set of accounts, who had signed and who had witnessed, and where each sum had truly gone. The young lord had written it all in a spare, upright hand, and gone away, and come again the next month, and made him tell it over. To be certain, the telling never shifted so much as a farthing. What house? She managed to ask, though her throat had all but closed on it. Marbeck, said the blind steward. As clean a house as stood in the West, and as foully served. And there is one living man who never for an hour believed the lie they killed the master with. 12 winters I have prayed for that man by night, and I have never once been given his name to pray it by. She walked home in the early dark, with the whole of it turning over inside her, and understood that she had married into the middle of a vast and secret work, 16 years in the doing, that not one soul in the loud gossiping county had ever guessed was going forward at all. A whole broken people, mended a few at a time by a hand that hid every trace of itself on purpose, so that none of the mended should ever catch him at the work, or be saddled with the awkwardness of thanking him. She had come to Wentmere certain she was the one creature alive who carried a debt to this speechless man that she could put no name to. She saw now that she stood at the tail of a long and silent line of them, stretching back years into the dark, and that she did not yet understand the first true thing about it. For why, in the name of all heaven, should a Duke of Wentmere, of every man in England, have poured out his life and his fortune to knit up a house that his own kind had helped to tear to pieces? After the almshouse, the sealing hour was a changed thing for her, though not one word was ever spoken to mark the change. She sat with him each evening still while the letters were dressed, but now she watched his hands go about their patient work and thought of the gate and the schoolroom and the blind man by his fire and the quiet between them, which for 3 years had been a correct and frozen distance, thawed by slow degrees into something she had no word for and was half afraid to hunt one down. They began, in their spare fashion, to talk. She would remark on the book open in her lap, and he would answer in 5 or 6 dry words that proved, once she had chewed them over, a great deal wittier than 5 or 6 words had any business being. Once she said of a pompous sermon she was reading that its author had plainly never in his life done the hard thing he was so free in commending to others, and the Duke, not lifting his eyes from the wax, observed that this was the common advantage enjoyed by bishops, who found virtue a good deal cheaper to praise than to purchase. She laughed aloud, the first laugh to leave her in that house, and he glanced up at the sound with such plain and startled pleasure that she had to bend to the letters to hide her face. The warmth of it frightened her. Everything her whole life had taught her rose up and cautioned her against it, and she leaned toward it even so, the way the half-frozen lean toward any fire, for she had been cold a very long while, and had forgotten there was another way to be. It was into the middle of this that the Marchioness of Estover came to call. Lady Vivian of Estover was a handsome woman near 60, smooth-faced and soft-voiced, with a graciousness so seamless that you never felt the blade go in, and only discovered, some little while after, that you had been quietly bleeding all along. She had come, she said, purely to pay her respects to dear Lady Grizzel, and to see at last the Duchess of Wentmere, of whom the wide world was told so remarkably little. She had heard naturally that the king's man was in the house upon the dreary business of the old forfeitures, and was it not the strangest thing, the matters a fresh rain chose to go raking through? And here she let her gaze rest a heartbeat too long upon Aveline's face, and Aveline, pouring, felt an old cold draught cross the back of her neck, and could not for her life have said from where. They talked, or the Marchioness talked, of houses risen and houses gone down, and by soft turns she brought the subject round to her host and to his silence, and she pressed upon it the way one presses a bruise to learn how deep it runs. It was such a pity, she said warmly, that the Duke would never give an account of himself. A man who offered no reasons for his doings, one scarcely knew where to have him. Her own dear late husband had always held that a man who will not explain himself has, as a rule, a doing somewhere that he would very much rather not explain. One heard, she said, and let the sentence hang open in the warm air, such curious things. Aveline set down the pot. She had not planned to speak. She heard the words leave her all the same. "You are wrong," she said, and her voice was low and did not shake, and so was he. 3 years I have lived beneath this roof. In that time, I have watched a maimed soldier handed a gate to keep, and his pride handed quietly back to him along with it. I have watched the children of ruined servants taught their letters by a purse that will not be named, and a blind old man kept warm to the very last of his days by a gentleman who does nothing in that room but sit. Those are not the acts of a man guarding some black secret he dares not speak aloud. They are the acts of a man who decided, long ago, that talking is a cheap coin and doing a dear one, and has been paying out the dear coin ever since in the dark, while the rest of us stand about in the light spending the cheap one on one another. The world could very easily spare a dozen of its clever talkers for one more man of that kind. There fell a silence in the room, like the silence after a glass has broken on stone. Lady Grizzel bent lower over her needlework and made a small noise that no one present chose to name. And the Marchioness of Estover smiled and murmured how loyal, how very loyal a young wife could contrive to be, and turned the talk aside. But her eyes had gone level and cold and busy behind the smile. And for the rest of that visit, she studied the Duchess of Wentmere, the way a woman studies a face she is straining to place from somewhere long ago. When at last she rose to take her leave, she caught up Aveline's hand, and held it a moment, and looked down into the open palm of it, as though the thing she had been reaching after all afternoon might be written there in the lines, and then she was gone, in a hush of gray silk down the drive. Aveline did not know, that evening, that she had stood up and spoken for her husband in a hostile room, and had thereby repeated, in its very shape and bones, the act that had cost him everything 16 years before. She knew only that she had spoken, and that it had felt like drawing a clean breath after a long time held under water. What she did know, with a chill that spread as the wheels of the gray carriage died away down the drive, was that Lady Vivian of Estover had come to Wentmere hunting for a particular something, and that somewhere between the tea and the door, in the quiet reading of a stranger's open hand, she had laid her finger on it at last. It was Lady Grizzle who gave way in the end, as Aveline had come to feel that somebody must. She came upon the old woman alone in the long gallery on a hard, bright afternoon, and Lady Grizel looked at her a while out of the black eyes that let nothing by, and then laid down her work and said, with no softening in it at all, that she meant to break a promise she had kept for 16 years, because she was grown too old now to stand and watch one more young fool go astray for the want of knowing a plain thing, and because she judged the girl to be on the very lip of doing something brave and past all mending out of not understanding. And she would a great deal sooner Aveline did the brave thing out of understanding, which had at the least some chance of turning out to be the right brave thing. "Do you know how your house came down, child?" she said. "All of it, or nothing but the piece they bawled in the street." "I know my father never did it," Aveline said. "No," said Lady Grizel, "he never did. And now I shall tell you who did, and what the knowing of it has cost the man you married. Sit yourself down." So she told it. She told of the old Duke of Wentmere, her own brother, a hard man and a frightened one, who had sat among the peers when a peer was tried by his fellow peers, and had voted with the whole herd of them to hand an innocent man over to his death, half out of cowardice, and half because there was good Marbeck land, promised quietly to any of the great who read the business the crown's way. Her brother had wanted the land. He had taken it. It lay to this day folded into the Wentmere rents, a black mark down the ledger that his son had never once been able to scrub away. And then she told of the son, of a boy of 19 who had loved the Marbecks and known the Earl for an honest man, who had somehow come by the truth of it, that the treason letter was a forgery bought and sold like a bolt of cloth, and who had risen up, a green boy with nothing at all on his side but his own certainty, in the very face of the whole gathered weight of the world, and had said it out loud. They found him amusing, Lady Grizel said, and there was no shake in the old voice, only iron. If you never come to grasp one other thing about him, grasp that one. It was not merely that they disbelieved the boy, they were entertained by him. A stripling standing up to accuse a marquess in defense of a doomed and friendless earl. His own father took him by the collar when it was done, and told him, before witnesses, that he was a fool who had disgraced his blood, and that if ever he unstopped his mouth on the matter again, there would be no blood left to him worth the disgracing. And that night, the boy learned the very lesson they were every one of them so eager that he learn, that his word, spent with the whole of his heart into a room that had no wish whatever to hear it, weighed exactly nothing and shifted exactly nothing, save to brand him a fool for the offering of it. It didn't save your father. If it did anything at all, it hurried him along the road. For see, they told one another, even the wild young Wentmere can scrape together nothing better in the man's defense than to swear blind that he is innocent. A blow of that kind does not teach a man to keep quiet for a season. It teaches him to mistrust his own mouth for the whole of the rest of his life. Aveline sat very still. So he gave it up, said Lady Grizel. He gave up ever explaining himself to a world that had shown him, to the exact farthing, what his explaining was worth. He would do instead, in silence, whatever silence had the power in it to do, and let the world make of him whatever it pleased. And it has made a great many idiot things of him, and he has never once stirred a finger to set a single one of them right. He laid 2 labors on himself and breathed a word of neither. To get hold of the proof he had gone without at 19, and to keep, wherever in the kingdom they had blown away to, the people your father's fall had beggared. 16 years he has spent, the two of them together. And when word reached him at the last that the Earl of Marbeck had left a living daughter, small and frightened somewhere under a borrowed name, he did the final and the largest thing his silence could stretch to reach. He found her. And because a ruined girl cannot be sheltered by a man's good opinion of her, but only by his name, he married her, to lay over her the one roof this vicious world still troubles to honor. That, child, is why your grate was warm the evening you first came, before ever you thought to ring for it. Not a companion's small comfort. A reckoning's. The old woman's hands were not entirely steady. There. Now you have the why of it. The why he has never once in 3 years given you. The reason is a debt, and it is his father's in part, and the whole world's in part, and in part, though he would go to the grave denying it, his own, for the one great crime of having been 19 years old and no stronger than any boy of 19 has ever managed to be. He has been paying that debt to you since the hour he first saw your face across a library. Aveline stayed a great while in the bright chill of the gallery, and understood, now, the whole of it. The wall raised about her in the dark, the gate and the school, and the blind steward by his fire, the man at the window holding himself back from speech by main strength of his 2 hands, and she understood, with an ache that emptied her lungs of air, exactly what the whole of it came to. Every kindness of that strange changed winter had been laid at the feet of a debt, and not at hers. Not one time in the whole of his careful secret planning had he looked to find in her a person he might come to want for her own sake. He believed himself to be settling, patient deed by patient deed, an old and terrible account. And she understood, sitting there in the cold, clean light, that she had gone and fallen in love with the man in spite of all of it, which was the brave and unmendable folly the old woman had watched coming up the road toward her. It was a bitter draught for a proud woman, and pride was very near the last coin she had left to her name. To be loved would have been one thing. To be atoned for was a wholly other thing. For a day and a night, she believed the one endurable course was the course her whole life had drilled into her, to take up the knowing and be gone, to stop being the living apology that a good man laid down every morning before a dead man and a memory. In the end, she stayed, and what turned her from the door remade every single thing that followed. For she saw, turning it over and over, through the long reach of that night, that she was not in truth only the object of his debt. She was also the one living soul in the world who could hand him back a thing he had lost long ago and never once looked to hold again. He had stood up in his youth and spoken a truth and been shattered upon it, and had not believed since that any word of his was worth so much as the air it took to shape. She could give him back the whole worth of his own word. She was the very proof he had spent 16 years hunting after, alive and breathing before him, the last of Marbeck, who knew the seal blind in her own palm and remembered the very smell of the accounts room and could stand up where her father had stood and be believed at last. She had come to Wentmere to be rescued out of the cold. She stayed at the end because she had grasped that she was the one with a rescue left in her hands to give. And for a woman stripped of all else, there is no treasure anywhere on the earth to match the discovery that she has something left in her, after all, to give away. The Marchioness of Estover did not strike as her husband had once struck, with a forged hand in the dark. She struck as she did all things, in the broad, clean daylight, sweetly, and in a fashion that could never afterward be laid at her own door. She had gone from Wentmere altogether sure of the thing she had come to find. She had seen the Marbeck stamp in the Duchess's face, the very set of the ruined Earl about the eyes, and she had felt, in the holding of that cool hand, the small, worn habit of a thumb that had ground a shape into its own palm across a whole lifetime, and she had known. The last of Marbeck had not died nameless in a ditch, as the comfortable world supposed. The last of Marbeck was the Duchess of Wentmere, and the odd, silent Duke had wedded her and folded her away in the fullest light there is, and were that ever brought up into the open, and the old case ever pried loose again, then everything Lady Vivian held in her two hands, the valley and the fortune, and the great warm honored name her husband had left behind him, would char away to ash like paper laid across a grate. She set herself to prevent it with the entire strength of a woman who has one thing only left to lose, and has no intention on this earth of losing it. She worked, as her kind always work, upon two fronts at one time. To the king's man she let fall, softly, all dressed up as a good citizen's unease, her certainty that the Duke of Wentmere was harboring beneath his roof and his coronet a person of a tainted and corrupted blood, which was a far graver matter than any dusty old forfeiture, and by the very harboring of her had brushed his own hand with the cold edge of treason. And to the county she let fall the other poison, the one that wanted no court at all to do its work, the whisper that the marriage itself was a shameful thing, that the mystery Duchess was no true wife, but a creature merely kept, that there was a soft rottenness under the fair stone front of Wentmere. She breathed these things out across a dozen drawing rooms with every appearance of the deepest reluctance, and left them to go about their slow, patient labor. And inside a fortnight, the two poisons had found one another, and married and bred, and become a single story. And the story was in every mouth, from the county town clear to the coast. Aveline felt it come the way she had felt the first ruin come, long years ago, by small, cold installments. A letter to Lady Grizzle gone unanswered, a morning call that somehow failed to arrive. And then, all in one gray afternoon, the whole of it fell at once, when she had driven out with Lady Grizzle to a house where the old woman had been made welcome for 50 years. The gates gave, the door was reached, and it was the daughter of the house who came out to them at the very step, flushed and wretched, to bring the word that her mother was, so regrettably, from home. Lady Grizzle, near 80 years of age, who in the whole long span of her life had not once been turned back from any door, sat rigid and upright in the carriage, and did not speak a single word until the gates were well behind them on the road. Then she said, in a voice trembling with a fury, that her great age had done nothing whatever to cool. So it is come to this at the last. They will sooner bar their doors against me, at my years, upon a lie, than breathe one cross word against Vivian of Estover. And underneath the fury Aveline heard, quite plain, the wound of it, and knew herself to be the whole and entire cause. Worse came the very same night. A plain man rode up from the king's officer bearing a plain and civil paper, and the paper required the attendance of the Duke of Wentmere, and of the person styling herself his Duchess, before a sitting of the Crown's commissioners in London, there to answer such questions as arose out of the forfeiture of the Marbeck estate. It was beautifully courteous. It was a death sentence, folded up neat inside courteous words. Aveline read it over the Duke's still shoulder, and understood that the pleasant, tireless hunter had gathered up enough at the last, with his stover feeding him quietly from behind, to draw the pair of them into a public room where one wrong answer, or worse yet, one true one, would finish her outright, and would very likely finish along with her the man who had hidden her. She made her choice that night, and it was the choice her whole life had drilled and drilled her to make. She would not stand up in a public room and be the destruction of the only two souls who had ever once been kind to her, without first naming a price for it. She would go. Let her be gone, and gone far, under some name no paper anywhere in the kingdom had ever caught, and there would be no last Marbeck left to unearth, no corrupted blood beneath the Wentmere roof, no proof of anything at all remaining but a strange marriage, and a stranger vanishing in the night, and the whole ugly talk would trail out of the county at her heels, and leave Lady Grizzel her collars, and the Duke his neck. It was the one single thing left that she could still do for any one of them. She took down the small bag she had pictured herself packing on that first frightened night under this roof, and this time she filled it in cold earnest, folding down into it the gray coat of her old invisible life, and in the black hour before the dawn, she went softly down through the sleeping house to leave behind the one letter she did not in the least know how to write. He was in the library when she came down, at the sealing hour that had come to belong to the two of them, as though he had known, the way he seemed, somehow, to know every current and eddy of that house, that if she meant to run at all, she would run from this one room. She stood in the doorway with the bag hanging from her hand and made herself lay it all out plainly, the whole of it, because he set no store by anything that was not solid and true, and the plainest possible truth, said plainly, was the last solid thing she had left in her keeping to give to him. "You have to send me away," she said. "You have heard the talk, and you know the mouth that it starts in, and you know that this hearing will finish me, and may very well finish you along beside me. Lady Grizzel was turned back from a door today, at 80 years old, on my account and no other. I will not stand up in that room in London and drag the pair of you down under the water with me. I know now why you married me. Your aunt has told me the whole of it. Your father, and the vote, and the boy of 19, and the debt of it all. And you have paid that debt, your grace, over and over, and past any hope of counting. I hold you to nothing further. You owe my dead father no more of anything, and me you never owed at all. Send me off, and let the whisper stream out of the county after me, and keep for your aunt her collars, and keep for yourself your hard-won quiet. It is the last use there is left in me for you to make, and I am standing here begging you to make it." There was a long silence then, and it was not cut from the same cloth as the other silences. She watched him reach, out of 16 years of iron-bound habit, for the pen and the wax to write her out his answer, the way he had written the whole wide world, its answers since he was a boy of 19, and she watched him look down at his own hand, where it lay upon the pen, and lift the hand slowly away again, and leave the pen lying just where it was. And she understood that a war was being fought, behind the still gray eyes larger than any she had yet seen waged there, the war of a man who had answered the whole earth in silence for so long together that plain speech had become to him a country foreign and far off, and who had come now, at the last, to a thing that no silence on the earth would ever answer for him. He came round the table and stood close to her, so that she was made to lift her face up to his, and he opened his mouth, and he explained himself for the first time, she thought, in the whole of his grown life. "You will stay," he said. "I let the word debt lie there between us, because a debt is a load I have always known how to shoulder. I have shouldered everything as a debt since I was 19, for a debt lays no claim upon a man's heart. Once it was a debt, it has been no such thing for a long while now, and I have been a coward for leaving you to go on thinking that it was. It stopped being a debt on the evening you argued a book with me across this very table, and were in the right of it, and would not blunt one edge of your rightness to spare a duke's feelings. I have wanted, every single evening since, to tell you so, and every evening I have taken up the pen in the place of my tongue, because a pen has never yet in this world been laughed at. And I learned young, down to the marrow of me, what it is to be laughed at for speaking a truth with the whole of one's heart. His voice came low and roughened, and it plainly cost him dearly, and he did not once stop for the cost of it. And I have learned a thing this winter that I did not know at 19. A truth spoken and turned to harm is a bitter load to carry to your grave. But a truth swallowed down whole that might have done some good in the world, and the swallowing of it dressed up fine and called good sense, that is a fouler load by far. I have worn my own cowardice as good sense for 16 years, and I have finished with the wearing of it tonight. He took the bag out of her hand and set it down upon the floor between them. I will not go on hiding you, he said, for the hiding of you has become the very same thing as granting that you are a thing which ought by rights to be hidden, and you are no such thing under heaven. You are the true daughter of an honest house, and I hold in my hands now the proof of it, that I went without at 19, gathered a single grain at a time across 16 years, and I am going to stand up in that hearing, in front of the crown and the county and Vivian of Estover herself, and do the one act I swore, after that night, that I would never do again so long as I drew breath. I am going to explain myself, the whole of it, what was done to your father, and by whose hand it was done, and what my own father pocketed for the turning aside of his head, and who you truly are, and precisely what you are worth, whatever the price of it to the name that I carry. There is a stain worked deep into that name that I have wanted 16 years to answer for, and I find that I can only answer it out loud, in the open, and I find that I can only bear to raise my voice at all in this world for your sake. He paused, and something shifted at the hard corner of his mouth that she had never once seen shift there before. So put the gray coat away again, Leander said, and in the saying of his own private name, he seemed to lay a small key down into her open hand. Trust me, and let me hear no more from you, ever, about leaving. For I know now, at the last, after 16 silent years, exactly what it is that I mean to say, and precisely to whom I mean to say it. And I mean to say it aloud, in the very room where the wrong was first done. The Crown's commissioners sat in a great cold paneled hall in London, and every soul in the county who could contrive the least reason to be present had contrived one. For the whole country by now knew the outline of the tale, the mystery Duchess and the wordless Duke, and the old dead scandal risen up out of its grave and walking, and not a creature among them meant to miss the end of it. Lady Vivian of Estover came to it, as one comes to a coronation, in her very finest, and she was received as such, for the world could plainly read the way the thing was bound to fall. The Duchess would be shown up for exactly what she was, corrupt and a tainted blood behind a stolen name, and the marriage for the quiet disgrace it was whispered to be. And the Duke of Wentmere, who had never once in the whole of his life explained himself to any living creature, who had sat mute beneath fouler blows than these for 16 years together, would sit mute now, as he had always sat, and let the flood come up and carry her off. Lady Vivian had raised the entire of her certainty upon that one foundation of silence. She had staked the whole of herself upon a single wager, that the Duke of Wentmere would do at this hearing precisely what he had done at every hearing for 16 years, which was nothing whatsoever. It had the look of the safest wager in all the kingdom. Aveline stood in the cold hall in a plain good gown, with her spine held straight, and was stared at by 100 people at one and the same time, who had all of them come to watch her fall. And she bore it, for she had borne a great deal heavier, and at her side Lady Grizzel bore it too, fierce and bolt upright and old as the standing hills. The commissioners read out their dry and dreadful questions in their dry and dreadful voices. Then the king's man, Sir Nevin Halcott, rose to his feet and laid before them, with every courtesy, the case that he had so patiently assembled, that there was strong and sober reason to believe the woman calling herself the Duchess of Wentmere to be in truth the attainted issue of the traitor Marbeck, kept knowingly concealed by the Duke against the plain interest of his crown. And Lady Vivian of Estover folded her gloved hands in her silken lap, and let her pleasant smile settle out upon the middle distance, and waited at her ease for the silence of the Duke of Wentmere to do all her work for her and destroy his wife. The Duke of Wentmere got to his feet. For a long moment, not one person in that hall understood what it was they were looking at, for the sight had no precedent anywhere in their memory. Here was a tall, dark, motionless man, whom the half of the room had never in their lives heard string above a dozen words together, rising in a public place, of his own will, to speak. They supposed he meant to enter some short, cold protest, and sit himself down again. He did not sit down again. He turned so that his voice should carry the whole length of the hall, and he began, and the voice came rough at the very first from long disuse, and then found its own feet, and settled into something that dropped down across the whole loud room like a heavy cloth let fall from a height, and the room went still to hear a silent man break open his silence at the last. "My lords," he said, "you have been asked here to rule upon a question of blood. Before ever you rule it, you will hear from me where the blood in this business truly ran. In this kingdom, a man is known before he is seen, and he is known by his seal, by the little print of wax that goes on ahead of him into every room and speaks for him there. 16 years ago, a seal was made to tell a lie. A letter was pressed with a false and borrowed hand, and then sworn true by men who should have known better, and upon the strength of that small coin of lying wax, an honest man was taken out and put to death. His name was Marbeck. He had kept his house and his books and his honor 30 years without one blemish upon any of the three. And a large sum vanished out of a trust he held, and a letter was brought forward in his own hand to prove him a traitor to his king. And that letter was a forgery, bought and paid for like a length of cloth by a man who had a hunger for his lands. He let that settle a moment into the stillness, and then he went on. I was a boy of 19. I had come by the truth of it, and I said the truth of it aloud, here in this same city, in a room breathing this same cold air, and the great men of that day found the certainty of a boy a very fine amusement, and they laughed, and their laughter was one more stone laid on the chest of a drowning man. I watched an innocent go to his death, the heavier for my having spoken too young and too hot, with no weight of proof behind the words to make them land, and I swore to myself that night that I would never again bring this world a truth it could lift up and laugh away. When I brought it again, I would bring it so loaded down with proof that no laughter living could stir it. That vow has taken me 16 years to keep. I am here to keep it. He drew out then a thin sheaf of documents, and he did not brandish it, but laid the papers down before the commissioners one upon another, naming each as it fell, and the cold hall had gone so entirely still that she could hear the low hiss of the fire in the grate behind the bench. The hand that forged the letter, he said, laying down the first, confessed to the whole of it, and set his confession down in writing, and had it witnessed before he died. The man who bought that forgery, he said, laying down the second, and named the sum, and named the purpose, in his own unmistakable hand, was the late Marquess of Estover. The stolen money, he said, laying down the third, went from the Marbeck Trust into the Estover coffers, where it has sat and grown fat these 16 years. And this last, he said, laying it down, spares me nothing, for it is the record of the grant of stolen Marbeck acres voted to my own father, in that same judgment, in payment for the closing of his eyes. That is the stain upon my house, and I have carried it in silence long enough, and I lay it here in the open now. Let it cost my name whatever it costs. He turned then, for the first time, and looked down the whole length of that watching room at his wife. The seal you carried into my house to bait your trap, my lords, he said, was the seal of Marbeck. My wife knew it at a single glance, across a crowded room, before her mind had time to catch her hand, because her father pressed the shape of it into her palm in the dark, on the last night his house stood, so that she might know her own, even when every other thing was stripped away from her. She has carried that shape worn into her own hand for 16 years. It is the one thing all your ruin could not take from her. She is no traitor's taint to be swept into a corner. She is the daughter of an honest house, and she is the living proof the truth of this matter has been waiting 16 years for. And she is my wife, married in law and married in honor, and since I have said far too little for far too long, married also in love. The forgery that destroyed her father will be undone, for I have brought you here the means to undo it, and any man in this hall who offers her the least unkindness from this hour forward will answer for the whole of it to me. And I find, after 16 years of holding my peace, that I have grown a very great deal indeed, that I am willing to say. There is a stillness that runs louder than any outcry, and it came down now over the whole bright, cold hall. And in the very heart of it, quite alone, Lady Vivian of Estover sat with the pleasant smile wiped at the last clean from her face. One by one, along the benches, the room turned upon her, and she looked, in that turning moment, not like the great lady she had built of herself across 30 careful years, but like the small thing that had always stood underneath the building, a frightened woman who had kept watch over a buried grave the whole of her life, and had just now seen a duke throw it open before every last person whose good regard she lived upon. She rose. She gathered up the poor, thin remnant of her dignity, which was not now a great quantity, and she went out of that hall alone, through a crowd that drew back from her on either side, the way a crowd draws back from fever in the street. And the doors of that whole shining world began to close upon her, one after another, in the weeks after, just as such doors had years before swung shut against a friendless girl, walking house to house in the cold with a borrowed name and nothing in the world to her own. That spring, they put her father's name to rights, by the proper forms, behind a closed door and with no crowd to it, since the loud part of the work was already finished and done. It cost lawyers and long months and every last ounce of a duke's weight thrown down hard behind it, and when the whole of it was done, there stood a dry document declaring, in the dry tongue that such documents are written in, that the attainder laid upon the house of Marbeck had been founded wholly in fraud, and was therefore struck down, and the name and the blood and the honor of that house restored entire to the Earl's living heirs. Aveline held the thing in her 2 hands in the library at Wentmere at the grey early hour, her husband standing close beside her, and read down the flat words that handed her back the very thing that had been torn out of her when she was 9 years old. And there, at the last, she wept, the tears she had drilled clean out of herself across 16 years of never once being able to afford its cost. He wrote her no card. He kept, this once, no silence of any kind at all. He put his arm about her and let her weep against him, and said the small, true nothings that are the whole of what there is to be said at such an hour. And it was the truest thing that he uttered in all that long winter of his late and hard-won speech. He never lived to know, she said, when she was able. My father. His good name is handed back to him, and he is gone from the world and cannot take it up. He went to his death sure that he had failed, that a whole lifetime of careful honesty had come down in the end to nothing at all, and that his girl was left behind him with a fouled name and not one friend anywhere on the earth. He did not go with nothing, the Duke said, and it was the very first she had ever heard of it. I could do nothing to save him, for I was a boy of 19, with neither weight nor proof to my hand. But I got to him the night before it was done, a stranger he had never in his life set eyes upon, and I gave him my word that I knew the lie for a lie, that I believed him down to the ground, and that I would never once lie easy until the whole of it was undone, however many years the undoing should come to eat. And I gave him one thing more besides. He was quiet a moment. A child was brought out of that house in the dark and set upon a carrier's cart, with a fresh name stitched down into her hem, and a little money pressed into the carrier's fist to carry her safe away and to ask no questions of her on the road. Your father went to his death, not knowing whether that child had lived to see the morning. I knew. I was the boy who paid the carrier. I chose the name that was sewn into her hem. I have known which quiet corner of the kingdom held you every year from that one to this, and kept you as far off from me as ever I could contrive it, for your own safety. And when you were grown, and I had gathered enough at the long last to shield you properly, I walked into a subscription library in a watering town, and let you go on, believing it the merest chance in the world. The seal your father set into your hand in the dark, so that you should know your own when all else was stripped away, he set there in the year before the end, against a day he must have felt was coming. He told me, right at the very last, that so long as one hand, somewhere in the world, still held the true device of his house, then his house was not altogether dead. Your hand held it. That is what the seal was for. That is what you were for. You have kept your whole house alive in the dark of your own closed palm for 16 years, and now, at the very last, you may open your hand and keep it in the daylight. She could not speak for a while. Then she said the one thing that mattered above the rest. You have given me back the whole of everything, she said, and stood up before the crown of England itself and named me aloud as no one's charity and no one's debt. So there is nothing left owing now between the two of us, and I can ask you the way I could never once have asked you in the winter, when I still owed you my very life for the keeping of it. Not marry me to keep me safe. I am safe. She reached up and laid her hand along the hard plane of his cheek, a thing she had never in 3 years once done. Marry me because I would have it so, Leander, and for no reason under all of the wide heaven, but only that I would, and then spend the whole of the rest of your life explaining yourself to me. For you owe the world no further account of anything at all, but you shall owe me one every single evening at this gray hour until the two of us are old and gray together. And I give you fair and honest warning, I mean to come and collect it. He gave her, by way of his answer, the rarest coin that he owned in all the world, which was a great many words, rough and unpracticed, and altogether true, and not one of them is set down here upon this page, for some sealing is a private matter between two hands. They were married again that summer at Wentmere, quietly, since neither one of them had ever had the least love of show, and Lady Grizzel sat in the very front of the church, wearing the settled look of a woman who had arranged the entire affair with her own 2 hands, a claim she went on to press well into her great old age, with perfect confidence and not the smallest particle of foundation. The doors that had once swung shut against the name of Marbeck swung wide open again now, every last one of them, hasty now and sheepish now. And Aveline found that the sight of their opening moved her very little, for she had learned by now, down to the last farthing, exactly what such doors were worth. Above the great door of Wentmere, hard beside the patient stone heron, she set the recovered seal of her own house, the hand that holds the sprig of broom that grows upon the very poorest ground there is, and flowers away in spite of it. And upon every letter that went out of that house from that day forward, there were two devices pressed down together into the one coin of wax, the heron and the hand, so that any porter anywhere in the kingdom, reading the fold of it before ever he came down to the name, should know at a single glance that here were two houses, once broken clean apart, that had grown against the whole massed wickedness of the world, back into one whole and standing thing. For there had been a time, and not so long before, when a woman lived in that country with no seal that could be shown, whose true mark, were it ever pressed into honest wax before honest eyes, would have opened her a grave, and one man who explained himself to no living soul had, without ever offering a word of his reasons to anyone, quietly laid his own seal down over hers, and kept her safe from that grave, through all the long cold of it, until the day the truth had gathered weight enough at last to set her own mark back up into the light where it had always belonged. It had begun in a courtroom 16 years before, with a boy who spoke a single season too soon. And it ended in the open daylight, with that same boy grown into his manhood, speaking at the very last exactly in his hour.